Hello. For this next tutorial, it's going to be a twofer. That's right, we're going to cover two different things at once. One, we're going to do something in Marauders colors, which is awesome. Two, I was thinking about this over the past couple of weeks, and I realized that some people may not be able to spray paint where they are. Let's say you're in an apartment building, or you've got nosy neighbors, or it's a health consideration. Whatever the reason, I'm going to show you that you can absolutely do this all by hand. That's right, we are going to hand brush a Marauders vehicle. It's totally doable, and it's actually a little bit cheaper than using spray paint. And for those of us that can't spray paint, it shows you that you can put out a quality custom without resorting to any sort of aerosolized paint. It'll keep the fumes down, it's less messy, it's certainly non-toxic because we'll be using acrylic paints. And with the state of the art of acrylic paints nowadays, worrying about brush strokes and thickness like that is almost a non-concern. We will talk about ways to make sure that your paint goes on flat, and I'll show you some techniques that I know how to make brush painting work very well. And in the end, we'll actually compare it to some airbrushed and some spray painted customs to show you that it's a perfectly viable alternative to using aerosolized products. So the vehicle I've chosen for this tutorial is the Shark. Now the Shark, I've done before in a couple of other teams. I've done a Tiger Force and a Python Patrol Shark. And it's already available in Sky Patrol colors, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Sky Patrol. But this one here has a whole bunch of little paint traps in it, little places where you might get overspray and whatnot. So it might actually be best to hand paint this one. And it'll certainly give us control to get paint in all of those little pipes and grooves and nooks and crannies in there. So I've already disassembled one. This one's being saved for something else. And we're going to start off with the priming process and everything else. So if you haven't seen one of my videos before, first off, welcome to the channel. Secondly, I highly recommend you start off with the first tutorial, which involves a polar battle bear. If you're impatient though and you want to stick around for the ride, I will briefly talk about previous preparation steps, but I won't spend as much time on them this go, because I think everybody now is getting used to the first basic steps, because they're the same across the board no matter what vehicle you're doing. So we're going to take this Shark and we're going to turn it into Marauders, and we're going to do it by hand using acrylics with the techniques I'm about to show you. So buckle up and let's go. Okay, so in this twofer we're going to do Marauders and we're going to paint it by hand. The Marauders thing we'll talk about after, but let's talk about the paints we're going to use. In this case, I mentioned that we're going to use, I'm going to use acrylic in this case. There's acrylic and there's enamel paint. Enamel's oil-based and acrylic is alcohol or water-based. The whole consideration behind this is that you might not want the stink in your apartment, or you've got health concerns, or you've got kids, or, you know, whatever. So a few things to know first about acrylic paints before we make our selections and carry on. Due to the fact that I build models as another one of my 14 hobbies, I have a selection of hobby paints, which means I have more than one brand. And what I've seen from experience is that not every brand makes every single color you may want. Now you might experiment, not in the college way, and find a brand that you particularly like, but be prepared to have to use a color from another brand. Classic examples are gaming paints versus model paints, and the fact that model paints are geared towards building military vehicles, which have very specific color recipes that are in a catalog called the FS 595 Alpha or something like that. And gaming paints have cool names like, you know, orc flesh, or, you know, witch poop, or whatever. So they're not always compatible. They may be similar in tone or value, but you may have a hard time going, oh yeah, I just need, you know, a European 1 gray from Model Master, but I need that in Warhammer colors or Citadel colors. And, you know, the closest thing you can get to is like Ashen, you know, Warlock gray or something like that. Anyways, it doesn't matter. All I'll say is be prepared to have to jump lines, even if you find a line that you like in particular. So what we're going to start off with is a little experiment I tried before, and we're going to do it again this time. We're going to start with our primer here, and this is Liquitex Gesso. You can get it at any art store. I think even maybe Wally World might sell this. But all it is this is the stuff that you put on a canvas before you do a painting. And it primes the fabric of the canvas, or if it comes pre-primed, some artists slap this stuff on to make it an even smoother surface. So it goes on thickly, but it pushes around very well. And by pushing around, I mean that blob of paint, so to speak, that you put on your vehicle won't stay there. The paint has high opacity because it is a primer, and you can push it and spread it quite well before it dries up and becomes a problem. So it may seem as a bit of a shock to some people watching this, but I use artist primer sometimes for my priming needs. Again, it's called black gesso. It says it there on the bottle. At any art store. You can thin it with water. All the stuff I'm going to show you can be thinned with water. This one I find the most forgiving, and it actually goes on very well, especially with the vintage G.I. Joe plastic. I'll show you the shark in a second here, but it goes on exceedingly well, and I'm using black, and there's a very good reason for that, which we'll get into later. So here's a selection of paints I use, the paint brands. This one, I'm not exactly sure what's happening with this brand. As far as I'm aware, it's still available. It's one of the older brands, but it is excellent. This is the one that's made for military models, and it's called Model Master Acryl, so that means it's acrylic. This color in particular is called Engine Gray, and it's one of the grays I use for my Slaughters Marauders schemes. There are multiple grays out there, so if you can't find this, anything that's a nice dark gray is good to go. The other brand I use is Tamiya. I prefer them out of the airbrush. I've been trying some stuff recently with thinning with their branded thinner, and I've been getting somewhat better results. So what I'll suggest is if you get Tamiya, get their thinner as well. And it's called X20A. It's alcohol based, so it does have a smell to it. It's not water. You can use water with this, but with all paints, whether they're enamel or acrylic, it is recommended to use their brand's thinner. Not a requirement, just a recommendation. Okay, so if you're going to get Tamiya, maybe have some of this on standby. It does have a smell to it, so if it's too much, then skip it. But I find Tamiya sometimes doesn't like to brush paint so well. Some of my paint is a few to several years old, so it could just be that it's run its course, and all these paints do have a shelf life of a few years anyway. But anyway, Tamiya has excellent colors. They're not always Federal Standard Match, that FS 595 I mentioned, but they are military colors. And a lot of model kits come with instructions specifically for Tamiya paints. And they airbrush, when we get into the airbrushing bit, exceedingly well. So I still keep them around. I have a bunch of them. I'm not just going to throw them out. But experiences may vary with Tamiya. But it is technically high quality paint. And then we've got Vallejo Game Color. Vallejo makes multiple lines. They make Model Color, Game Color, Model Air, Game Air, and that's just preloaded for, pre-mixed, for airbrushing. I enjoy their paints a lot. They come out in a squeeze tube, so they're actually designed to be squeezed into a palette here and almost used like Bob Ross would do a painting. So you actually squeeze it into the palette and then brush it from there. You can squeeze some directly onto the brush if you wish, but depending on what you're doing, that may not give you the control you want. So Vallejo is another brand. They also have their own branded thinner, but work just fine when being thinned with water. And I guess I should show you the difference here between the squeeze bottle and the jar. Both Model Master and the Tamiya are a jar, so I won't shake it or anything, but just to show you that, you know, it's a jar. You put some in there, dip your brush in, blah, blah, blah. It's old school. This is a squeeze bottle, so when you shake it up and you're ready to go, you got the nozzle there and you just squeeze it out into your palette and you're good to go. This takes a little bit of getting used to, and you will squeeze out more than you need. Okay? There should probably be a so to speak in there. You'll squeeze out more than you need, so to speak. And it takes some getting used to. So little bits at a time. You can always pour more in. But it's quite an excellent paint line. I'm not married to any one of these in particular. I use all three of them. In fact, my colors for this build, if you wish to follow along, are Tamiya. Come on, focus. Of course it's not going to focus because I need it to focus. Anyway, it's Red Brown XF64 by Tamiya. I'm using Game Color Goblin Green. I'm using XF26 Deep Green. And just for some fun, I'm using Citadel Color Layer Scaven Blight Dinge. That's what it's called. I don't make this stuff up, okay? So those are the colors I'm using for this build right here. And as I go through and talk to you about how to paint this, I'll give you my thoughts on painting each one of these individually. Now what I have done is I have put a little bit of their proprietary thinner in these jars. I use pipettes to do that as well. So another tool that'll be useful to you when you're brushing is getting a bag of these. I got these from a hobby store. If there's no hobby store near you, maybe an arts and crafts store will have some pipettes. Anyways, you know, it's like a turkey baster, right? You suck the juice up, so to speak, and then you spit the juice back out. Definitely not so to speak. And that helps you mixing and control portions and stuff like that, but it's an indispensable tool. So grab yourself some pipettes. So we talked about brushing. Why are we brush painting? Well, we've done spray painting, right? And we know how fast and convenient that is. But we haven't talked about the fact that there are some advantages to brush painting. Like even when you spray brush and when you airbrush, you will always do touch-ups with a brush. You can't escape brush painting, so all we're doing is taking the whole project and doing it by brush. The advantages, minus the spraying of the aerosol and the fumes and all that stuff involved, even with acrylics, even with airbrushing. This is quieter. You can do this indoors year-round. And you do get some better control. You won't necessarily have any bleed under. Like, remember when we were doing the masking for the Python Patrol, we pulled up the tape and there was some bleed under? You have a little bit of a better grip on that with brush painting. But bottom line, all it is that, you know, spray paints can be expensive. Airbrushing is an expensive hobby to start. And if you don't want to get into all that, then brush painting can absolutely be done. So make sure you got some water here, and I've got some water in this whatever cup, it doesn't matter. And you want to make sure you have a nice clear space because it's going to be a lot of body English. And just before we begin too, you can even brush on these clear coats. Sorry for not mentioning that earlier, but there's various clear coats. This is Model Master, this is Vallejo. You can brush them on, no problem. Always clear coat your work. So I've kind of started the shark here, and not to worry because I saved all the juicy bits for the video. And I promise I didn't do anything else. Just kidding, there's a whole bunch of it right there. But anyways, we'll get to that. Don't look at that. Let's do one better. Let's just take it off the table. There we go. Okay, so the whole deal is with brush painting is to pick the right brushes. And that's not to say you got to go out there and buy some $40 artist brush. You can get a pack of like 10, 15 brushes, whatever, for like $7 or some combination therein. And all I'm using right now is a nice flat brush. This has those bronze or brass colored bristles on them, whatever they are. I think they're synthetic or something like that. Don't go overboard on your paintbrushes. Some people will say, well, if you want better art, then you need better brushes, blah, blah, blah. I've met professional artists that use crap, busted up brushes, and they're professional artists. So don't worry about any of that, I'm telling you right now. This is a normal brush. I've had this for years, and it does me just fine. The reason why we're going to use a flat brush for this is that most of the work is just applying broad strokes and then getting into some nooks and crannies. For those nooks and crannies, I have, and this is probably not going to focus. Maybe it's going to focus. I don't know. The usual trick of putting the hand in front's not doing anything. But take my word for it. This is a thin, flat brush. It's the same as this, but smaller. And that's all we're going to use. We don't need any detail brushes per se. And this I don't consider a detail brush. I consider it a nook and cranny flat brush. So don't quote me on that, because I'm sure some art teacher somewhere is having an aneurysm for me saying that. And we're just going to shake up our gesso a little bit here. And I'll show you how thick it comes out. It does come out quick too, but just by dipping the ends of the bristles in there, you can see it comes up in a glob right there. And I don't know why this isn't focusing, but either way, trust me, it's globby. The good news is we're about to sort that out. And then the nice thing is too, is that because it's acrylic, it dries very quickly. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some paint in here. There's no secret technique to painting large flat surfaces. It's push on the paint and make sure it doesn't bunch up and get brush strokes in it. So here we go. The gesso itself is very thick. I won't say it's like molasses, but it's certainly not as viscous as some of the hobby paints are. And that's we're going to use that to our advantage. And the thing with this is that the secret, like we talked about in other videos, is keeping your brush moist. Not wet, but moist. And I know some people don't like that word, but whatever. And the reason being is that because acrylic is water-based, it dries quickly. So by keeping a moist brush, you won't have the paint start to dry on here, and then you're depositing chunks of paint onto the model. So it may seem tedious or repetitive, but the whole thing is to keep your brush moist to get the paint applied in its proper form, let's call it, onto the, I was going to say model, then I was going to say miniature, onto the vehicle. But really, these painting techniques apply for everything. So, you know, if you're working with 3D printed parts, for example, when you're finishing off your customs here, the same painting principle applies. Or if you're deciding to do something smaller and detailed, whatever. So as you can see there, it goes on rather opaquely. There are some brush strokes in it, so you have to be, the good thing, you have to be cognizant of that, and you can keep brushing as the paint's drying. Worst case, if you slap it on, like your prom date did there with the makeup, then you can just keep going over it. And worst case, if it dries like that with some brush strokes in it, you can just get that fine sandpaper or that scrubbing sponge I showed you in the other video, and you can just use that to knock it flat. If at any time anybody's offended by my sense of humor, please feel free to leave the room and go get a spine. I'm just kidding. I love everybody. So let's go. Yeah, and that's really all there is to it here. I'm just blackening up these areas here. And some of you might be wondering, why are you using black primer? Why not white primer? Well, the fact of the matter is, I like working in a black primer. What it does is it provides a few advantages, and this is an ongoing philosophical debate, if you will, in the model building community, is when you paint the whole model black first before putting any other color on, even if it's going to end up black, it's called black basing. And one of the fundamental advantages to it is that it, if you miss a spot with the paint or it doesn't go on as well, it looks like natural weathering. We're not looking to weather this per se, unless that becomes your style, in which case this is definitely, I would recommend this as a way forward for you. But quite honestly, I just like the way the black gesso behaves. Even the white gesso doesn't seem to go on as much, but there's something about the black gesso, and I could be crazy. I just like the way it behaves. And the other thing too is that once you put your color on over top of this, as long as you put on the right amount and the right thickness, it won't matter that it's black underneath. Because some people say that the color of your primer affects your colors, and I will say yes, it does, but only if you let it. So if I put let's say a light green on very lightly over top of this, yeah, it's going to be very dark because the black primer is still showing through. But if I put a nice opaque coat of paint on there, it's going to look like it's true color. So if I've confused any of you so far, I'm sorry, but I've only had 16 coffees today. So we've done some flat areas here, and you can see that it's drying. There's some streaks there, but that's actually just because I just went over it, so it's just drying at a different rate than the paint that's already dried around it. So I'm just kind of overgoing as we go. Now, the technique when it comes to getting into these grills and everything here is really just a vertical application of the brush, a dabbing action. We did this with the spray paint. Same thing, where you have to shoot vertically in from different angles. It's no different with the brush, except with the brush you can wiggle the brush. Like right now my bristles are touching the vehicle, as you can see it shaking, and I'm just wiggling the brush around in there and letting the bristles basically do some twerking in there, and getting the paint deposited in all those little nooks and crannies. And this is where the advantage of brush painting really comes forward, is that you would have to do this regardless, almost, well, I should say, depending on how crevicey, how many nooks and crannies your vehicle has, you would probably have to go in there with a paintbrush anyway to get all those places, because sometimes spray just won't make it in. And that's where the brush comes to the rescue. So in this case, we're cutting out the middle person, and we're just going straight for the brush. And it's a matter of angles too, so you want to do it from all the different angles that you can see, and get it in there. Now, when you're doing this, because gesso goes on thickly, you want to keep it light on the brush. So don't load it up so much, and just keep moving it around until you're happy. And the good thing is that if you have a big glob in there, you can run your brush along it and basically scoop it out, for lack of a better term, and then just deposit it somewhere else on the vehicle. That's happened to me a few times. It's not a big deal. And we know ways, sanding or scooping out the paint to keep that to a minimum, if not completely eliminate it. So yeah, I'm just wiggling my brush around in there, and it's leaving paint everywhere I want. Now, does this imply that you're gonna? I better moisten up my brush here again. Does this imply that you're not gonna have to go back and go fill in some spots? No, because the thing is that when paint goes on, it's shiny, and when it's shiny, it looks light. So for right now, I think I've got everything in there on a white model. But once this dries flat, I'll see all the spaces I missed. In which case, you just go over again. It's no big deal, right? We're all here to have fun, and yeah. So now you've seen in there, I've deposited all the paint in that section there. I've got some of my brush here, so I'm just going to finish going on in there. I'll angle this towards the camera a little bit for you, so you can see I'm just dabbing it in there. We're not worried about losing detail because we're going to get any excess paint out of there. And if I have to go back in after when it dries to get some spots I missed, then that's just fine. There we go. And the paint will go in there. And if you see that you're starting to wipe paint away where you don't want to, just move away and go to another section. Come back to it when it's dry. It's not a big deal at all. So now we're going to cover this. And as we do this, especially with the Shark, and there's probably some other vehicles out there too where you'll have to make this consideration, is what to do about these two posts here. If you're unfamiliar with them, they're the same posts. They basically, in the vehicles, you know, out of the box presentation, let's call it, you put two torpedoes on there, but these pegs are special because they're actually the same style and size as the pegs of G.I. Joe backpacks. So the intent was that you could stick two G.I. Joe divers on there, or hopefully divers, or maybe a captured Cobra guy and you could keel haul them. But anyway, you could put figures on that. So the question is if you paint on this and clear coat it, is it going to be durable enough to withstand having an action figure put on it and pulled off it again? I'm going to say a week maybe. And all that means is I never make guarantees for this stuff because it might work for me and then you try something and do something slightly different or the conditions are different and it doesn't work for you. I'm just going to put torpedoes on this thing eventually, so I'm not worried about putting dudes on it, so I'm going to paint these pegs. The choice is ultimately up to you. Just going to re-moisten my brush a bit here. There we go. And the thing to remember with this stuff is, although acrylic is, oh, that's a lot. I don't have anywhere else to scrape it. How about that? Right there. There we go. With all acrylic paints, yes, they're not toxic. That doesn't mean that it's a good idea to ingest them. You will have a lousy day and potentially do serious harm to yourself, up to and including who knows what. So for whatever reason, let's say you got kids or something like that, young kids, toddlers, or who are we kidding? Teenagers, right? Because all those stupid TikTok challenges. Just keep this stuff bottled up and away from their reach. Same with, definitely with the thinners too, because they're alcohol based. And not the drinking kind of alcohol, in case somebody gets any ideas. None of this stuff is good. I guess the only thing I would say about acrylics is that they won't necessarily kill you, but I'm not a doctor, so I wouldn't test that theory. And that's it, right? The good thing is this has, I mean, it smells a little bit like the paint you used as a kid in preschool, right? Like that tempura stuff where it came in hockey pucks. It barely has an odor, so you don't have to worry about that sort of thing. Because I know some people who didn't wear proper protection when enjoying their model building hobbies and are now forbidden to use any sort of aerosolized product. And I think a few others that have a particular odor because it did some permanent damage to them. So yeah, always an idea, you know, keep this stuff out of your eyes, out of your nose, out of your mouth, out of your kids' mouths, because the whole point of here is to have fun and be safe about it. Because if you only do one of these, what's the point? Because you're going to want to do more, I promise you. Having this kind of fun is not a one-shot deal. In fact, it's almost like the Frito-Lay challenge? Yeah, I dare you to try just one. But anyway, I'm sure that was a copyright infringement and someone's going to knock on my door. It's like, dude, it's potato chips. Calm your stuff, okay? So yeah, we're still going here. I'm just getting the paint in, and as you can see where it's drying, where it looks shiny, and there's actually paint missing. That's nothing to do with the adhesion of the gesso. It's actually doing extremely well. It's just because coverage, and I gotta wiggle my brush in there a little bit more, and there we go. Now you might use different primers. There's a lot of acrylic primers out there. The choice is yours. I find some of them just don't brush as well. I have Vallejo's primers, which are gorgeous for airbrushing, but I find that they don't brush on so well. I'll caveat that with saying I've owned my primers for a long time, so maybe they were just a bad batch or they went bad. But I have a newer primer of theirs, a gloss black, for doing chrome work, and I just find that it doesn't brush quite as nicely as other stuff does. But going out of an airbrush, it's like almost without peer. And that's the good thing, because before acrylic paint, model paints came out, everybody was using enamel, right? So paint thinner and the fumes and all that stuff. And when enamel first came out, it wasn't a very good formula. So it got a very bad rap for durability and everything else. And acrylic is not as durable as enamels because you're doing basically a microscopic rubber layer of paint over something by staining it, which is what an oil-based paint does. Excuse me. But that's changed over time, and acrylics used to, when I was a kid anyway, building a model, I remember I was building a Tornado, it's a jet fighter, British jet fighter, and it just would not stop bubbling. I don't know why, but turns out that was just evidently a common problem with early acrylics or something. Acrylics now, I swear by them. In fact, I have some enamel paints from a long time ago now. I don't even want to say how long ago, and I won't even touch them. Just because they're stinky, and I don't like the smell. Not that I'm inhaling the stuff when I wear a respirator, but it's the after effects, right? Because after you clean your airbrush or clean your brushes and everything like that, it's still the after effect, the after odor, if you will. It's quite piquant and gives me a headache. So the good thing with acrylics is most of them have a very inoffensive odor. I'll say most, because there might be one out there that I haven't tried that stinks to high heaven. So I make no guarantees, especially about how sensitive your sense of smell is. So what I will say is I found acrylics very inoffensive as a hobby tool. So we're still going here, just a little bit of an update if you're playing along here. Or given the sick background music that you're dancing, which is totally cool, because if you're not doing anything and you're watching this, then you should be dancing while you're watching this. Because it's just, dancing's good for you. Dancing is just really good for you. Even if you don't think you're any good at it, just do it anyway. Like your wife's already, or your husband, for the ladies out there, your spouse is already married to you. So what could go wrong? Don't ask. Yeah. So the black gesso. When we come to apply color, I'm foreseeing maybe the need to be a little overly generous with some of my brighter colors. But the opacity of them, in this case the Goblin Green game color, is actually quite excellent. And the texture that it leaves behind, it's very dull, but you can feel that because it's flat, it has that texture to it, so it's going to grip paint really well. If you've never seen any of these videos before, first, welcome to the channel. Secondly, a gloss surface does not accept paint well at all. So if you want to paint this, it's a relatively smooth plastic, so it's somewhat glossy. You need a primer that will actually bite into the plastic. Sometimes it's called etching. With this gesso stuff, it's just a paint prep tool. I honestly couldn't tell you what's in it that makes it work so well, because I'm not a doctor. But it works, and it's cheap. Because the whole thing behind this too, right, is aside from the health considerations and the noise considerations and all that other stuff, it's a little bit cheaper on the old wallet there. So especially given the challenge that the economy's taken to see how fast they can make inflation work, maybe the less expensive option is the way to go. Being frugal doesn't mean you're being cheap. It means you're being smart with your money, your hard-earned cashola. So here we go, just working that in there. And you can see I'm getting it into the troughs and, sorry, let's flip this around here. I'm working the paint into all these little nooks and crannies, those greeblies that we talked about. If you're still new to the term, greeblies is basically all these little boxes and pipes and details and everything that paint won't necessarily go into unless you coax it a bit. You gotta coax it a bit. Yeah. And don't ever expect to get this necessarily done in one coat. This gesso is behaving very well, but I'm still seeing some places where I'll have to go back in where paint didn't stick or whatever. But having said that, it is outstanding in its application so far, and I really couldn't ask for something better. We'll see what happens with the final product. I can't remember if I know I've used gesso as a color before, like black gesso as the final color on stuff, because it's easy and because it behaves as nicely as it does. I've used this for, this is what I use for my stripes on my Tiger Force stuff. For the most part, when I did that previous tutorial, I tried a new paint just to give you some options. But gesso is definitely a worthy option. I didn't mention it before because I wanted to stick to hobby products, and gesso can be somewhat unforgiving, especially if you go quickly. It all depends, really, I guess, on how fast you're doing things and how practiced your hand is, so to speak. But just putting this stuff on here now, you know, it's applying the color itself, and then it's ensuring that it's not leaving behind any brush strokes in texture. If it goes on thinly, that's fine. In fact, primer doesn't have to be opaque to perform its function. A lot of times when I prime my models and stuff, and even some of my customs, the primer doesn't get everywhere with 100% opacity. As long as there's some of it there, it's actually just enough to grab paint and hang on to it. Now, having said that, as you watch these videos and we have these discussions, by all means, there's other customizers and painters and model builders out there. So if you're having doubts or you want more than one opinion, check them out. They may tell you something that I forgot to tell you or that I don't even know. But it's always good to get more than one opinion, I think, on a lot of things. You know, like you're going to do something electrical in your house, you don't just watch one YouTube video, you watch at least 1.5 before you start poking around in the circuit breaker, right? So there we go. So you can get the idea of what's going on here. Most of the hull is colored. I got to do the bottom of this stuff too. Now the other consideration, right, and this goes back to our planning process that we've spoken about, but we'll go over it again with this, is that when you reassemble this, it has hatches where the guns pop up and everything else. So you choose what you want, obviously, but you're gonna probably want to paint the inside of this too, because if you open it up and you see the original white color, it kind of breaks the illusion, right? And we're all talking about suspension of disbelief here. I mean, this is a flying submarine, for crying out loud, right? So I think in my mind, the best customs or anything like that is where the illusion isn't broken. And that's from, you know, paint smear, paint chipping, or they forgot to paint something, or they missed something at an angle or whatever. You know, and that's not to say mistakes won't happen, but take that extra time to paint the interior. So this is where the hatches will pop up and those two little forward firing guns are in each wing. I've painted the inside of that black, and it's eventually going to get the base color of the Marauders line, which is this deep green. When you look at any of the vehicles, like the Equalizer, the Lynx, you'll see that for the most part anyway, as far as I can remember, the very first color on the vehicle starting at the nose is this dark green. And the Equalizer has green panels, and I'm going to use that to good effect when I do another Slaughters Marauders with my airbrush here in the Skyhawk form. So my overall color is going to be this dark green. So the interior of the cockpit's going to be painted that, the interior of these black areas here is going to be painted that, so that it starts off with that dark green. And what it'll do is it'll, again, carry on that illusion that we are dealing with an officially released product here, even though it's not. I'll give you a quick preview just to show you what I'm talking about here. I had to start the camouflage pattern early. Don't worry, you'll see it done in a video as well. But I needed to find the right colors for you, and I needed to hone in on my technique and make sure I wasn't going to blow sunshine up your butt. So these are the colors applied already, and these are the colors I mentioned previously in this video. If you agree with them, you can use them. The lighting here is a little different. I've got a natural light overhead and a yellow light for my close-in work, but I'm satisfied. I've stared at this thing for a few weeks now, and I'm quite happy with the colors. We're going to talk in detail about going over this and how to make it look good and everything else, and not worrying about brush strokes and all that. What I wanted to draw your attention to was the interior. So you can see, minus the shadow there, that I've made it that dark green, the same dark green that's on the nose here. That's going to be the color of the plastic was dyed in, to carry over our illusion. So even the insides here are going to get all painted up in green too. But but I wanted to do that and inspect the vehicles and say, okay, you know what, it's that green color that's the whole plastic is for the original vehicles. So I started already with the pattern. And not to fear, like I said, we're going to talk about this in good detail to set you up for success. So don't worry about this for now. This was just to make sure that my concept was going to work. I would never do anything without you. So I would hate that. Hey, here's a tutorial video and all they do is show you the end product and they just talk about what they did without showing you how they did it. That's not a tutorial. That's show and tell, which I love. However, we need you to be able to do this on your own. So I'm just going to carry on applying black to the back here. And we'll be able to call the priming process complete. A little hiccup in the video there. Not nearly anywhere near the level of proficiency with working with video and YouTube as I should be by now, I guess, compared to everybody else. But hey, it's the thought that counts. So all I'm doing is filling in this back grill here. And you might see my brush move quickly, but fundamentally all I'm doing is I'm taking a loaded brush, we talked about that, right, where there's paint in between all the bristles, so you got a nice brush that looks like that, and I'm just applying it in a nice smooth stroke all the way down. I'm just doing it very quickly. And some of the success you'll experience will be from your brush stroke technique. So if you just lather up your brush, like slap paint on here and push it around and then it starts drying on you and whatever, you know, that's not what you're going to be going for. What you want is a steady, saturated application. And saturated is not Latin for dripping wet and, oh man, I can't find enough paper towel to unscrew this up. It is a matter of patience. I've got relatively steady hands. If you've got shaky hands, then just brace yourself on the edge of your table like this. And then you're just moving. Like all I'm doing right now is flexing my fingers to move, and you can see how smooth that gets. Because if you sit there like this, you know, with 24 coffees in you, or one of those take 10s times 3 in you, you're just going to have the jitters. Or if you have some health, you know, something's going on, or you never had steady hands to begin with, place the top of your wrist on the corner of a table and just flex your fingers, and that'll move for you. Okay. If you still have shaky hands, just experiment first, right? You don't want to have your first application of paint on there to be unstable. So try on, you know, even a piece of newspaper or a piece of cardboard, and find the posture that works for you. I tend to bend over a lot and then lean my hands on the table if I'm doing stuff, especially fine detail work. That just eliminates that, because your hands move even when you breathe. If you breathe, your hands will move up and down or left and right depending on how you're standing. Either way, it doesn't matter. Your hands will move when you're breathing. So for the, let's call it ham-fisted application of a primer coat, it's not so much of a concern. But as we get to defining the lines of our camouflage for this pattern, it'll come into play. It'll come into play. So, and that's not to, like, get creative. You know, I can't speak to anybody's life story or anything like that. You know, maybe you got something going on where your hands can't stop shaking. See what works for you before you commit paint to plastic, because you want this to be successful and enjoyable on all counts, right? So, and we're all in this together. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, if you think I kind of spent not enough time on one subject or too much on another part, let me know in the comments below, and I'll answer your questions and address any shortcomings in the next video. I'm just putting some paint on the edge here, and we'll call that good for this part of the video, this part of the series. So what we're doing right now is we've just brush painted on some primer. We're getting it into all the places that we want. You can see that it's drying quite nicely. Some light streaking in there, but it's not three-dimensional, so I'm not worried about it. It doesn't stand proud of the surface of the plastic, because this is just what the rest of the paint's going to grip onto. And one last time, in case you don't want to go back to the beginning, because this video was a little long, but it lets you know that the hand painting process takes a while. This is Liquitex colored gesso. It's black, and it's available at all your art stores. So we're going to call it for there. I'm going to do some final touch-ups and prep for the next video. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, put them below. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you on the next video when we start applying the actual colors of the Marauders scheme themselves. So until then, be safe, don't eat acrylic paint, and have fun.